this assignment, and it asks you to integrate MySQL with a Spring Boot project. Right? So you have already, by this time, I believe most of you have completed the previous project assignment of setting up a Spring Boot instance running on AWS. Okay? We have there's a link here that you can links back to that previous assignment. And also, there's a couple of slides that walk you through. There's some there's some images, some screenshots on what to expect and how to set it up and configure. But it's replicated here step by step. Right. And the objectives here is that is for you to configure a remote MySQL instance running on AWS that you can connect to it remotely using MySQL Workbench. So it asks you to download and install Workbench for your particular machine. And then the project that you had started in the previous assignment, now we want to connect it and have it integrated with that SQL instance. Also introduces a technology that we're going to cover a little later in more detail, Java Persistence API, or JPA, that allows you to interact with the database, but just manipulating just regular plain old Java objects, so that when you instantiate a new object, it automatically does an insert in the database. Whenever you modify the object instance, it does an update in the database. Whenever you anything you do to the object instance in memory and RAM, it's automatically synchronized with the database. Right? So we'll cover that topic a little later in detail when we talk about ORMs. But nevertheless, I want to get you going. Also, this also introduces another topic that we're going to cover in another lecture, is to expose the data model through a web service endpoint, right? That is going to allow us to access that data from outside just by hitting a URL. We'll be able to retrieve that data. We'll do inserts, updates, select statements that will retrieve the data in a particular format. In our case, we're going to be focusing on representing that data as JSON, right? But it could be represented any which way we want. Could have been XML. Could have been we chose JSON since it's a pretty standard way of representing data, especially on web applications. So the first step will ask you to log into AWS, and last time you went down the route of creating instances in Elastic Beanstalk. Right? So this time around, it's going to ask you to create a RDS or remote data source data instance in using those services in AWS. Right? It will ask you what engine do you want. We're going to choose MySQL. And if you want to play around with non-SQL databases, that's fine as well, if you want to instantiate those too. But these steps walk you through support MySQL. So anyway, it's going to ask you a couple of questions and configure the for your particular course. I'm using the same instructions in a couple other courses, so we're using this kind of setup. It'll ask you to configure the database instance, the course identifier, the username and password. Just remember those username and passwords, because you'll need it later on to log in remotely from the database to the database. So make a note of those. Then it'll ask you a couple other things, and here it walks you through the whole step. At the end, it will tell you how is it that you're going to connect to the database remotely, and so you'll make a note of this URL of where the actual database is running. Okay, you're going to need it so that from Workbench you'll be able to connect to it remotely. Also, the local project that you have running on your machine, it will also be using the remote database. Okay. And you do need this. you do need to set up the security group. So I'm gonna take that off. Yeah, the connection is not going to be publicly available, and you will need to set up and configure a security group. Right, so that'll be the database will be running at this point in the remote server on AWS, and we're going to connect to it remotely using MySQL Workbench. MySQL Workbench is a free tool that provides a user interface that you can remotely connect to any database, any MySQL database, and send commands, SQL commands to it to create tables, insert, remove, delete, manually, right, from a command line. So here's where you're going to download it, you're going to install it, and follow the instructions. You're going to set up a new connection. It's going to ask you for the port. You just keep the default port. This host name is the host name that you copied earlier, the .com URL. You're going to use that host name. The username and password is the username and password that you created earlier. Okay. It walks you through creating a very a simple sample database. Just by clicking this icon over here and giving it a name, you can just call it sample, and then it also asks you to create a brand new table, and just give it a name. I mean, this is only for testing purposes, to just make sure that Workbench is working, that you can interact with the database, you can insert, just to make sure we're not going to use this table for anything else, right? It's only for testing purposes. You're going to create a table just once with with two fields, just ID and message. And then we're just going to check to see if we can insert. It's going to create a little insert command where you're going to just paste some dummy data in there. Don't use my name, use your name. And you're gonna run execute the query. It's going to insert a new record into the database. And then we're going to do a select statement just to see what data came back, to make sure that there was data inserted in there. And then it asks you to just try it again, right? But now insert just some other dummy data, right? Maybe like SQL is great, Java's awesome, whatever. So now that we know that the remote database is running, that we can connect to it manually and interact with it manually using Workbench. We want to be able to interact with it programmatically, okay, using the Java language. So to do that, you're going to open up the project that you were working on earlier, right? The one you worked on last week that you deployed, and so you're gonna configure a new file, application.properties, that's under source main resources. And you're going to set up this data source configuration. You're going to use your server, the .com, that URL that you you set up earlier, and the schema will be CS5200 or whatever course. If it's not there, it will create it, right? If the schema is not there. This is the username and password from earlier. Right? So we're configuring our Bootstrap project, right, to be able to connect to it, to connect to the database. Let's see what else. Here I think there's the driver we're going to be using, MySQL JDBC driver. We're going to add a dependency on the POM file, right, so that it downloads and installs the correct library, the correct connector, so that the Java can connect to it. What this is going to do, here we're going to configure JPA. So JPA is what I mentioned earlier, right? It's an object relational mapping technology that allows you to interact with the database from an object-oriented point of view. Right? It allows you to create classes that are related to one another, that point to each other, that have lists of other classes and instances in RAM, and allows you to map them and say, oh, by the way, all these classes, they map to these tables. And whatever you do to the objects in memory, you are doing it to tables. Okay, so that's what JPA does. Again, we'll cover that in much more detail a little later on. And one of the things we need to configure says, hey, take the following Java classes and map them to tables. And by default, the name of the tables are going to have the same names of the classes. That's the default. Okay, and we have to annotate in the code saying, hey, this is a class that I want you to convert into a table. And what JPA will do is that it will auto create those tables, right? It will generate all the the SQL create statements, and boom, we'll create these tables in the database. Now the auto here can be configured to with different values. Create means every time this application gets deployed, it will blow away all the tables, right? And it will recreate the schema from scratch, based on the classes and the fields. It will regenerate them, and that's actually okay while you are developing. As early on in the development cycle, it's okay. I mean, you might be doing some prototyping. You might be modifying the classes. You might be adding more classes, changing names of the fields as you iterate over your development cycle. Okay. So it's okay that the schema, the database tables and fields, might not be representative of the actual schema you're going to end up with, right? So it's okay to be blowing them away every time. Eventually, as your project comes to a stable state where the data model, you've settled on a data model, right? You've done your UML, and we all agree on what the design is, right? More or less, a good idea is to change this create to be update. Right? Update. Once the schema is not changing dramatically, update is a more lenient where only changes will be made. Right. One problem with recreating the schema is that any data you had before will be blown away. You won't have it, so it's somewhat frustrating, right? If you created some test data and whatnot, you don't want it to blow away. So you might want to change this to update, right? Maybe not this first assignment, maybe the following assignments. Changes to update, and it won't blow away previous data that you had when you redeploy the server. Okay. And if you do change and you add a field or you rename the field, what JPA will do is it'll make a best guess of what you meant, right? That says, what it'll do is that it will take a look at the schema and the object model that you have in Java. It will do a query to the database and look at the tables and the schema and see where they're different. And it will realize, oh, you have this field, now you renamed it to this other name, and I'll rename the field in the table, right? So it's pretty smart, right? But don't trust it entirely. Okay. So create, make sure that you always have the latest schema based on the latest data model. You can configure some debugging so that you can whenever as you interact with your data model, when you create, update your data your objects in RAM, JPA is going to be sending commands to the database to insert, update, delete, whatnot, right? And it's interesting to see the actual SQL queries that the JPA uses to interact with the database. When we're interacting with the objects in RAM, it's pretty interesting. So you can turn that on. You can turn this on and look at the logs. It'll print out in the logs all the commands that it's sending to SQL, to MySQL, right? To enact your actions. In production, you don't want this. In production, you don't want logs, any of that. You would turn it off. But while you're developing, it's actually very interesting to look at, right? What the actual SQL queries that it's using. These are some other what the type of the language you're going to be using, or the dialect of the SQL language that you're using. That it can test whether it still has connections to a database, right? It can send a connection, say, am I still connected to the database? So anyway, so configure that, and that should get your web application connected to a database. What else? Let's see. So this was for me. These are the values that I chose. Maybe not the password. So additionally, you'll need to add in your POM file, right, the project object model. You'll need to add this dependency. This is what tells your project that you need additional libraries, right, to talk to the database. So one of them is going to say we'll need to download the jar file that allows us to connect to MySQL, and the other dependency is that will that if you're using Java 9, you'll need this additional dependency in your dependency section, right? And also, if you have Java 9, you'll need this plugin, the Maven War plugin, right? That deals with Java 9, right? If you have Java 8, you don't need these two. Okay. All right. So once you have that, you're going to need a some object that we want to map to some table in the database, right? So here's a very simple hello world object, right? Again, this is the most trivial example I could come up with. Here's a very simple object that has a very trivial name. It has two fields. It has only two fields: an ID field and a message field. I thought it had a message field. Oh, I think maybe in the previous assignment there was a message field, wasn't there? Okay, yeah, right. So all right. So here we're editing that what you worked on last week, right? The only thing we're doing here to convert this and make it that it stores to a database, it's very simple. The only thing you need to do is tell the JPA infrastructure that this is an entity, right? Entity are part of the JavaX persistence package, right? And it's a decorator, and it tells the infrastructure that this should map to a table. This should map to an SQL table and you can choose the name, hello. Right? If you don't choose the name, it will guess at the name that you want based on the name of the class. Right? So the name of the table would have been hello object, the name of the table. Right? So here, but you can override that and say, no, I want the instances of this class, I want them to map to rows in a table called hello. And the ID fields that we had in the previous assignment, I want you to use this ID as the primary key. Right? This ampersand ID decorates this field as a primary key. Okay, so it'll create it'll make enforce the references and the constraints in the create statement. And additionally, we're decorating it. How is the value being set for this ID? Do I want the responsibility of setting that value, or do I want to delegate that responsibility to a database? In this case, we're saying I don't want to generate this value. Instead, I am using the strategy, right, to generate a generation type identity. Right. What this is saying is that I'm delegating the value of this ID to the database. I don't want to have to generate it. Right? So what's going to do is that ID is going to, if it's MySQL, it will use auto increment. Right? Meaning that as you insert, right, this ID will increment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. Yes? If instead of MySQL, it would have been just plain old SQL. It would have used the identity constraint. Right? What else? I think that's it. That's the only thing you need to change in your hello object from the previous assignment. And that's it. That's all you need to do, and it will save to a database. All right, pretty cool. Let's see, what else? You'll need to create an additional class, right? That it's going to configure the fact that I want to store that particular object, right? I want to store it as in a database repository using the JPA library, right? And that's all you have to create: the hello repository, and extend this base class, JPA repository, and you need to provide the class that we're going to be storing in the database and the type of the primary key. In our case, like, our primary key is just an integer, but it could have been a class. Right? It could have been a class, and that class might have contained several fields. Yes, and what that would have generated is that the primary key would have been maybe a compound primary key with multiple fields that need to be unique. Once you've done this, it's only 4 lines, right? That's it. Once you have this repository, you can now use this object, this hello repository object. Now you can use it to store hello objects, or retrieve hello objects, or update hello objects, right? Or query for all the hello objects out there, right? Which is pretty cool. You just say you use an instance of the hello repository, and here we have an example of that in your controller. This is the same controller that you worked on last week, yes? But you're going to add a couple things. You're going to add a couple things. One of the things that you're going to do is first get a hold of that repository that you just created, yes? Right? We're going to auto wire. We're using injection, right? When this controller is instantiated, right? It's going to have this variable already mapped, having a reference to an instance of that repository we had earlier, right? We created earlier. So that in here, right, an instance of the hello controller is going to have an instance of the hello repository, and we can use it. We can use it, for instance, to write to the database, to insert a new instance of the object to the database. It's going to generate an insert into a database. Right, let's see how it works. First, we're exposing it to an API, right? We're exposing it to a URL, right? So that if you go / localhost blah 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 /API /hello /insert, right? What are we doing here? We are creating a brand new instance of the hello object, right? Only with a string. Notice no ID. I'm not telling what the ID is, right? I instantiate it just like any other object. There's nothing special about that object. And now I can use the hello repository .save. See that? .save. I pass it the object, and that's it. I'm returning the object after I create it. What this is going to do is that it's going to generate a synchronous, not asynchronous, a synchronous call to a database, right? To the URL that you told it. It's going to log in. It's going to generate an insert statement into the database, pass the data. It's going to insert into the database. It's going to generate an ID. So by the time we return from this save, this object is going to represent some record, some new record, brand new, inserted into a database, right? So if I right here, if I ask it, what's your ID? It would tell me. I'm ID number 123, whatever. Right? It's auto incremented, okay? Because it has been inserted. The database knows that it's auto incremented, so it'll just increment the ID. Even though I didn't set it, I've delegated that to the database. Yes. And when I return it, that object will have the ID plus the message. Yes. Everybody good? Let's see what else. Here's another simpler example. Here's another simple example that just it's incrementally more interesting. It's incrementally more interesting. Instead of inserting here a hard-coded message, here we're always inserting that particular message. Yes. Here we've made it parameterized. You can pass in the message, right? So that here we have /API /hello /insert / a parameter. You can pass it as an argument, we can map that argument to a local parameter string, right? And here I create the hello object, but now it's parameterized. That's the only difference, right? It's saved, and then return the object with the new ID and the message. Yes? So it asks you to right, so yet another one, yet another example, where we want to create another endpoint that's going to return all the instances that have been up to this point inserted into a database, right? All the records up to this point, and the repository allows you to do just that. You can say hello repository dot find all. That's going to create a SQL, select star from whatever, right? From hello. That's going to return all the records. And notice that all those records are going to be mapped to a list of hello object instances. How cool is that? Right? I don't have to read those records. I don't have to iterate over any of those, right? They're going to be magically all instantiated, right? And going to be returned as a list of hellos, and will return a list of hello objects. Okay? So those three, we're asking you to add, and this will verify that your database is connected. We do, I think you need to add, you need to add Spring Boot Servlet Initializer to the main class that you created earlier. Since we are using a little more sophisticated URLs, right? The previous URLs were pretty trivial, but now we have to parse things, and it's a little more. We have to generate every list of JSON objects. So we need to add some of this magic here, the serval initializer. You might have to do that. You might have had to do that in the previous assignment already, maybe. npm clean install, and try it locally. So this is what would return from your first insert. If you do it a couple more times, and you go to select all, it returns all the records that you have inserted so far with the IDs 1, 2, 3 with the same message. This asks you to insert some random messages like JPA rocks, Spring's the best, whatever. Insert these as URLs, and then select all and verify that you had the previous 3 that you had earlier, plus the new 2 that you've inserted. And I think that's it. It asks you to use Workbench, right, to see that indeed these records are being inserted in the remote table. Okay, just make sure that indeed this is being inserted. Redeploy, and the new war file, you'll need to deploy it and verify that the remote URLs work. All right, so just the way you test it locally, test it remotely to see if it works. Okay. All right, that's it. All right. Any questions? Make sense? All right.